Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone. This is Jim. I've been a member of the Chingus since November of 2016, and hopefully I've come across or met all of you on Slack. The goal of this video is to share my team's Voyage 2 experiences with the hope that it's going to give you ideas for what to do in your future projects, and more importantly, what not to do. The information we're going to be discussing today is going to center more around how we worked rather than what we produced. So specifically, we'll be discussing about how we managed our project, the obstacles we encountered in that effort, and how we got around them. So on a personal note, I signed up for Voyage 3 with some reservations. I was already working on one very large Chingu project as well as another smaller project, and I was really concerned about dividing my time across not just two projects but three. So in summary, I'm really glad that I participated in Voyage 2, and we'll talk more at the end of this about what I learned personally and what I got out of the voyage. More important than me, though, is our team. I was really lucky to have a team that had very broad range of experience and expertise. Oxras hails from Colombia. He's our resident expert on Vue.js and on all things Epinata, which if you follow in Slack, you'll know that's a long-running joke. Tryon hails from India. He's our expert on AI and machine learning, as well as he has a very solid foundation in full-stack development. We kid around a lot of times that he's also a bot. We're not sure he's a real person. Sarah hails from the U.S. Northwest. She is our expert on styling and CSS and UI UX. We couldn't have produced the product that we did, the app that we did, without her taking our functionality and making it into something that was presentable. So the goals that we had for our Voyage 2 project was, number one, we wanted to create a project that would be useful to the Chingus and hopefully have a life beyond, longer than Voyage 2. Just as importantly, we wanted to stretch ourselves. We wanted to establish stretch goals and get ourselves out of our comfort zone. We wanted to learn new technologies, which quite frankly involves taking some risks. We knew at the beginning of the project we were going to make mistakes, but we also knew we were going to learn from those mistakes. So very briefly, the project that we decided on is called Idea Nebula. It's basically a tool that lets the creator of an idea define an idea and then get feedback from a peer group to make that idea more mature and stronger. A major feature of the app is that for certain types of ideas, we protect the intellectual property of the idea creator by requiring that the reviewers accept an agreement that defines the terms. So let's move in and talk about how we structured our workflow. Really, our work was centered around what were the tools that we used, but also what were the processes around those tools. So the four tools that we used for managing our work were GitHub for our remote repo hosting and sharing, Trello to manage our backlog and to track our sprints, Slack and Hangouts for communication and team meetings, and then ESLint with the Airbnb rules for code standardization. All four of those are really key, and we'll talk more about each one as we go through this. So in terms of processes, how do we communicate and coordinate our efforts? Well, we started out with twice weekly video conferences that started out with defining the application, what was its purpose, its goals, its scope, pardon me, and what are the tasks in the project backlog. As we progressed through the voyage, we transitioned to working almost totally in Slack. We communicated every day with Slack, and we used Hangouts really for special sessions where we felt like we needed a video conference to resolve an issue. The second process we implemented, which was early in the project, and is really a one-time effort, was to define the project stack. And we started doing this by getting an understanding of what each other's pros and cons were, what technologies we were familiar with, what our desires were in terms of what technologies did we want to learn. And we consciously decided to use 1 to 2 things that new technologies that again would help us learn and stretch. Our development workflows, again, early on in our very first team meeting, we established rules and guidelines for how we were going to work together. So that's centered around not just the communication, but how we would use our tools, primarily Git. Some suggestions, some things we did is basically setting up some guidelines for how to name your branches in a meaningful fashion is very important. What I do is I tell you to take a look at Cornell's Medium articles on Git. The very first article has some really good suggestions on how to name your branches. We also set up a hierarchy of branches where our master branch was defined as containing what's in production right now. Our development branch contains what we're working on that has been unit tested that will be released to branch in the future. And then we created individual branches for our assignments in each sprint. Those individual branches, once they were completed and unit tested, those were then PR'd into development. And any future individual branches were based on what's in the development branch. We also committed often and worked to create commit messages that describe, why we did something rather than how we did it. We did have lapses. I have to admit, I have one branch when I was doing the Heroku deployment that has an awful lot of repetitive messages, deployed to Heroku. And there's some very good reasons for that because I was committing to Heroku rather than to GitHub. But at the same time, for someone that's reading those, it's a fairly useless message. Something else that we did is we tried to update README as information became complete and solid. We didn't try to put a lot of stuff in README that was going to change because that's just unproductive. And it was important. It's important to keep the README updated, not just with what the app is, but for things like how do you promote it to production? What are those steps that you use? It's a good way to share information among the team and also with any future collaborators that may join the project. So the technologies we used for the front end, we picked Vue, Vuex, Vue Router, and Stylus. For the back end, Node.js, Express, and Mongo. And then in addition to that, we used Auth0 for our authentication service, Heroku as our app hosting service, and MLab as our database hosting service for Mongo. Of these technologies, Oxyrus was the only one that had experience in Vue. I had some light experience in Stylus and Mongo, and some light experience in Auth0. But all 4 of these were things that we really needed to learn and we're trying to stretch ourselves on. So some of the problems we encountered along the way and how we got around them, we use Trello for tracking our sprints, for managing our backlog. We wanted to give it a try over GitHub, even though GitHub has some real advantages in that it's simpler and it's integrated with obviously with your repos. Trello lets you type longer text, so it's easier to get more expressive. And it also has some nicer UI features. However, one thing that I hit as a project manager is that when I copied the current sprint's project board to create a new project board for the next sprint, Trello copies the cards, the story cards, but it doesn't copy the member assignments. And that was a major pain because as the backlog grew, I would spend probably 30 minutes each week in reassigning members to the backlog, both to what's in progress right now as well as what had been completed, so that we had again a record of who had done what. And there was no workaround that I found for that. A bigger obstacle that we had was our outside workload. All of us were working on multiple projects other than just the Voyage 2. Plus, different members of the team had university obligations, family obligations, and other Chingu projects they were working on. And the way we addressed that is basically communications number one. When someone had an issue or wasn't able to get something done, they raised their hand in Slack and said so. The other side of that is that team members stepped up, and as they had time and could help, they volunteered. So we shifted workloads to get done what needed to get done. Mongo was an issue because Mongo is not bad, but Mongo has a very narrow use case. As a NoSQL database, it means there's no joins, no referential integrity, no cascading deletes. There's something like stored procedures, but it lacks a lot of the features that we've come to expect in a SQL database. And that caused us a lot of problems. We got around that by basically spending a lot of time learning Mongo, and we also spent a lot of time making sure that our test data was coordinated with our schema, because that was a major source of issues that we encountered. Heroku wasn't an issue, but how we used it was, we have a non-standard runtime environment as compared to simpler projects. We have 2 servers, in essence, that are hosted out of the same GitHub source repo. Doing that deployment requires some steps in Heroku that you don't run into in Free Code Camp or some of the other things we do in the Chingus. We got around that by doing a lot of research, a lot of reading, a lot of collaboration, and really 3 nonstop days of just work on Heroku. But we got around it, and there may be a Medium article that'll come out of that experience. So the lessons we learned along the way, basically stretching yourself beyond what you know has substantial benefits. It's the best way to combat the imposter syndrome. And while it increases the probability you're going to make mistakes, you're going to learn a ton from those mistakes. It's well worth the effort and the aggravation. Ask for help when you need it. Nobody knows it all. Nobody ever will. The environment's just too broad, too complex, and changes occur too rapidly to the JavaScript ecosystem for any one person to know everything about anything. When you have a problem, take the time to research it to a certain point, but don't waste time. Just make sure you haven't missed the obvious, and then ask questions of your teammates and within Slack to the wider Chingu community. You'll end up saving more time than you'll waste by trying to solve everything yourself. Set up your workflows and your standards early in the project. We used that first team meeting to define how we were going to work together, and it paid off. It was well worth it. Also, meetings are hard to coordinate across time zones. Nobody likes boring meetings that waste your time. So when you do decide to have a meeting, have an agenda, follow up with meeting notes. The latter is especially useful because there's always somebody that won't be able to make a meeting. So if you publish your meeting notes on Slack, everybody can see what happened. They can jump in and clarify or ask other questions, and it adds to the value of the meeting. Also, no one owns the code base. Each team member jumps in when and where they're needed, even though you're not the original author of a particular part of the code base. That's a key responsibility of everyone. So finally, some personal observations. I got a lot out of this voyage. It made me a better developer. It put me in contact with some great people. I've made friends with my team. I love working with Andres, Parminder, and Sarah. thank all three of you. You did an amazing job. And for you and for everyone else, we'll see you in Voyage 3.